The rain hadn't started yet when 17-year-old Alex Mitchell made the decision that would tear his family apart forever. Sitting at the dinner table in their pristine suburban home in Savannah, Georgia, he watched his father Robert scroll through his confiscated phone with the kind of cold fury that makes the air itself feel dangerous. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Robert's construction-roughened hands trembled slightly as he read the text messages. The sweet, innocent conversations between Alex and his boyfriend Jake from boarding school. Messages that talked about holding hands during movies, about stolen kisses behind the chapel. About a love so pure it made Alex believe he could finally be himself. Robert's face went from pale to crimson in the space of a heartbeat. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something Alex had never seen before. Not just anger, but terror. Raw, primal terror that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than disappointment. Alex's mother, Sarah, sat frozen, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, watching her world prepare to implode. She knew this moment would come eventually. She'd seen the signs, felt the truth in her heart for years, but knowing something and living it are completely different creatures. The explosion, when it came, shattered more than just the evening quiet. Robert's fist slammed into the mahogany table with such force that Sarah's wine glass toppled, spreading dark red across the white tablecloth like blood from a fresh wound. "You've destroyed everything." Robert's voice was barely human, more growl than words. "Everything I've built, everything this family stands for. How dare you bring this sickness into my house?" But Alex had reached his breaking point too. Years of hiding, years of watching his father's casual cruelty toward anyone different, years of swallowing his truth to keep the peace. It all came pouring out in words that would haunt both of them forever. "At least I'm not a coward like Uncle Tommy was." The mention of Robert's dead brother seemed to break something fundamental inside the older man. Tommy, the brother who jumped from the water tower at 17 rather than face another day of their father's rage. Tommy, whose secret Robert had discovered too late to save him. Tommy, whose ghost lived in every cruel word Robert spoke about people like his son. What happened next would scar them all. Robert dragged Alex to the truck, threw a hastily packed bag at his feet, and drove into the gathering storm. Sarah's desperate pleas were lost in the engine's roar as they disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with the terrible certainty that she was about to lose her child the same way Robert had lost his brother 28 years ago. The rain began falling just as Robert's truck pulled away from the Interstate 75 overpass, leaving Alex standing alone in the growing tempest, 40 miles from home. No phone, no wallet, no hope. Just a 17-year-old boy learning that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who abandon you when you need them most. But what none of them knew was that this moment of destruction would become the first page of a story that would change their small southern town forever. Because sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or wondered whether truth is worth the price we pay for it, you're not alone. Subscribe to Heart Stories for real stories about courage, redemption, and the complicated journey toward becoming who we're meant to be. Because every ending is also a beginning, and Alex's story is just getting started. The LGBTQ youth shelter in Atlanta smelled like disinfectant and hope mixed together in equal parts. Alex had never imagined such a place could exist. A converted warehouse where rainbow flags hung next to hand-painted murals, where teenagers who looked like walking stories of survival gathered around mismatched tables sharing meals that tasted like safety. Marcus had driven through the night to get him here, the former Army Ranger's steady presence the only thing keeping Alex from completely falling apart. But even Marcus, with his broad shoulders and quiet strength, couldn't hide the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. The deployment orders had arrived that morning, 2 weeks until he shipped out to Afghanistan, leaving Alex to navigate this new world alone. The other kids at the shelter sized Alex up with eyes that had seen too much too young. There was Maria, a transgender girl from rural Mississippi whose parents had tried to pray the truth out of her until she ran. The twins Devin and Damon, mixed-race brothers whose conservative black church had declared them abominations. Charlie, the homeless veteran Alex had met under the bridge, who'd been discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and never found his way back to belonging anywhere. They listened to Alex's story with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something that felt almost like resentment, because Alex had money for college, had a mother who slipped him emergency cash, had privilege that most of them could only dream about. His abandonment was traumatic, but theirs was systematic. A grinding down of spirit that had lasted years instead of a single devastating night. The wake-up call came when Alex received an email from MIT's scholarship committee. The viral video of his abandonment had reached the admissions office, and suddenly his full ride was in jeopardy. We must consider whether family instability might affect your academic performance. The carefully worded message explained, perhaps it would be best to defer enrollment until these personal matters are resolved. Alex stared at the screen, watching his future disappear because he dared to tell the truth. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. Stay silent to preserve his scholarship, or continue speaking out, knowing it might cost him everything he'd worked toward. That evening, Sarah appeared at the shelter's front door looking like she'd aged a decade in a week. The meeting happened in a small conference room. Alex on one side of a scarred wooden table, his mother on the other, with Marcus standing guard by the window like he expected Robert to burst through at any moment. Sarah's confession poured out like water through a broken dam. Her sister Maya, the family secret nobody talked about. Maya, who'd loved women, who'd been cast out by their Southern Baptist parents, who died of an overdose in a San Francisco alley at 25 with no family to claim her body. Sarah had been sending anonymous donations to LGBTQ charities for 15 years, trying to atone for her silence when her sister needed her most. "He's not a monster," Sarah whispered, tears cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. "He's broken. He watched his brother die rather than accept who he was. And now he's watching history repeat itself with you. I can't lose both my boys to this fear." The weight of generational trauma settled over the room like dust. Alex began to understand that his father's cruelty wasn't just prejudice. It was terror. Terror of losing another person he loved to a world that had shown him no mercy when he was 17 and helpless to save his brother Tommy. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness. And when Pastor David Chen reached out through the shelter's network, offering to help bridge the gap between Alex and the conservative community, Alex faced another impossible choice. Work within the system that had rejected him, or burn it all down and rebuild from ashes. Marcus pulled him aside before the meeting with the pastor, his soldier's discipline barely containing his own demons. "I failed my family when I came back from my tours," he admitted. "PTSD, anger. Couldn't save my marriage or my relationship with my daughter. Don't want to fail you too, but you're stronger than I ever was. You'll find your way even when I can't be there to help." The truth hit Alex like a physical blow. Everyone was fighting battles he couldn't see. His mother carried 15 years of guilt over her sister's death. Marcus struggled with trauma that made normal life feel like walking on broken glass. Even his tormentors at the shelter had stories that made his own pain feel small in comparison. Real strength. Alex began to realize, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing how much of your pain you'd let poison the world around you. The documentary series began as righteous anger, but evolved into something far more dangerous. Alex called it Growing Up Mitchell, and each episode peeled back another layer of his family's buried secrets. The production value was amateur, shot on borrowed equipment in the shelter's makeshift media room, but the raw honesty cut through screens like broken glass. Episode 3 featured Tommy's story, pieced together from old yearbooks, newspaper clippings, and the trembling testimony of his former classmates who remembered a gentle beau who drew pictures of birds and wrote poetry about flying away. The episode ended with Alex standing at Tommy's grave, reading from the suicide note that Robert's mother had finally surrendered after 28 years of guilt. "I hope Robbie learns to love himself like I never could." Alex read into the camera, rain beginning to fall on the weathered headstone. "I hope he gets to be the man I was too afraid to become." The response was volcanic. Within 48 hours, the video had been shared across every social media platform, tagged with hashtags that split their small Georgia town down ideological battle lines. Robert's construction company lost the contract to build the new Baptist Church Fellowship Hall, a project worth more than half his annual revenue. But the collateral damage spread far beyond Robert's bank account. Manuel Vasquez had worked for Robert's company for 8 years, sending money back to his family in Guatemala while raising 3 children in Savannah. When the church boycott expanded to include all of Robert's subcontractors, Manuel found himself unemployed with no explanation beyond the whispered word association. His wife Maria cleaned houses for families who suddenly no longer needed her services. Their eldest daughter, Elena, Alex's former classmate, wouldn't meet his eyes in the school hallway. The guilt hit Alex like a physical blow when Devin confronted him in the shelter's common room. "When does justice become revenge?" Devin asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned these lessons the hard way. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're using your privilege to hurt people who never hurt you." The private investigator Robert hired was thorough and ruthless. Within a week, Alex received formal notice of a defamation lawsuit, complete with a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of his family home. But worse than the legal threats was the fabricated evidence. Carefully doctored documents suggesting Alex had lied about his scholarship credentials. Anonymous tips to MIT claiming he'd plagiarized his admissions essays. The attack was surgical and devastating. Alex's acceptance to MIT was suspended pending investigation. His reputation, built on years of academic excellence, crumbled under the weight of allegations he couldn't immediately disprove. The boy who'd fought for truth found himself drowning in lies, discovering that his father could wage war just as effectively as he could. Marcus's deployment came at the worst possible moment. The goodbye happened in the airport, 2 men trying not to cry in a place designed for temporary farewells. "Strength isn't defeating enemies," Marcus said, his uniform making him look older, somehow, more breakable. "It's healing wounds. Don't become the thing you're fighting against." The words haunted Alex through the following weeks as his campaign consumed everything in its path. Sarah's teaching career evaporated when the school board forced her to choose between defending her son and keeping her job. She chose Alex, delivering a speech at the board meeting that cost her 20 years of professional standing, but earned her something more valuable: her son's forgiveness and her own self-respect. Pastor David Chen emerged as an unlikely ally, using his position within the conservative community to tell Tommy's story from the pulpit. The sermon was controversial, splitting his congregation between those who saw compassion and those who saw betrayal. Chen faced his own reckoning when the church board threatened his position, forcing him to choose between institutional loyalty and moral courage. But the most unexpected development came from Alex himself. Watching his mother sacrifice her career, seeing Manuel's children go hungry, witnessing the fear in Elena's eyes. The weight of unintended consequences began crushing his certainty. The boy who'd started this war to reclaim, his voice began to question whether some victories cost more than defeat. Late at night in the shelter, surrounded by kids who'd lost everything long before they found their courage, Alex faced a truth that felt like swallowing glass. Sometimes the people we hurt in pursuit of justice are the ones who can least afford to lose. Sometimes being right isn't the same as being wise. And sometimes the hardest lesson we learn is that every choice echoes far beyond our own pain, creating ripples that can either heal or destroy the world around us. The investigation into Alex's scholarship credentials moved with the relentless efficiency of a machine designed to destroy futures. MIT's Academic Integrity Committee pored over every essay, every recommendation letter, every test score that had earned him his full ride. The fabricated evidence was sophisticated, just credible enough to raise questions, just suspicious enough to demand answers that Alex couldn't provide quickly enough to save his acceptance. Meanwhile, Savannah tore itself apart along lines that had been drawn long before Alex ever spoke his truth. The vandalism started small. Rainbow stickers scraped off car bumpers, LGBTQ support signs, stolen from front yards. But it escalated with frightening speed. Someone spray-painted slurs across the shelter's front wall. Pastor Chen's church windows were shattered during Sunday morning service, sending glass cascading over terrified parishioners who'd come seeking only peace. The town's tourism board, desperate to protect Savannah's reputation as a charming southern destination, quietly pressured local businesses to distance themselves from the controversy. The antique shops and bed and breakfasts that formed the economic backbone of the historic district began losing bookings as word spread about the family values crisis threatening their peaceful community. Alex watched the destruction from the shelter's common room, his laptop screen filled with local news coverage that painted him alternately as a heroic truth teller and a dangerous radical. The comment sections beneath the articles revealed a community split so deeply that neighbors who'd shared Sunday dinners for decades could no longer speak to each other without shouting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert's mother, Margaret Mitchell, had remained silent through weeks of escalating warfare. But when the death threats against Alex began arriving at the shelter, anonymous messages promising to finish what the family should have done years ago, she could no longer contain the secret she'd carried since Tommy's funeral. Margaret appeared at the shelter on a gray Tuesday morning, clutching a shoebox that held more pain than any container should be able to bear. Inside were Tommy's belongings, the diary he'd kept through his final months, the letters he'd written but never sent, the photographs he'd hidden from a family too afraid to see who he really was. The diary entries revealed a truth that shattered everyone's understanding of that terrible night 28 years ago. Tommy hadn't killed himself in despair over his sexuality. He'd done it because he couldn't bear watching 17-year-old Robert suffer under their father's rage. Robert had discovered Tommy's secret and tried to protect him, taking beatings meant for his older brother, enduring their father's cruelest punishments to shield Tommy from the worst of it. Tommy's final entry, written hours before he climbed the water tower, was a love letter to the brother who tried to save him. Robbie is stronger than I am. He'll survive this family, survive this town. He'll grow up to be the man I never could be. I just pray he learns to forgive himself for not being able to save me. The revelation that Robert had been victim before he became victimizer didn't excuse his treatment of Alex, but it explained the terrifying desperation behind his cruelty. He hadn't abandoned his son out of hatred. He'd done it out of the paralyzing fear that history would repeat itself, that loving Alex meant watching him die the way Tommy had died. Alex sat in the shelter's courtyard reading Tommy's words, understanding finally that trauma doesn't move in straight lines. It spirals through generations, shaping victims into perpetrators, turning love into fear, transforming protection into abandonment. His father's cruelty had roots that stretched back decades, watered by grief and tended by a society that taught men that vulnerability was weakness. The legal battle reached its crescendo when Alex was forced to testify in his own defense against the defamation charges. The courtroom was packed with supporters and opponents, the air thick with tension that felt one spark away from explosion. Alex's testimony, delivered with the painful honesty that had started this whole war, revealed not just the facts of his abandonment, but the emotional archaeology that had led to it. But the victory felt hollow when Alex returned to the shelter that evening to find Elena Vasquez waiting for him, Manuel's daughter. The girl whose family had paid the price for Alex's crusade sat in the lobby with the exhausted dignity of someone forced to grow up too fast. Elena didn't shout or accuse. She simply handed Alex a photograph. Her little brother Carlos at his birthday party, the cake decorated with characters from a cartoon Alex remembered loving at that age. "He doesn't understand why Daddy can't find work anymore," Elena said quietly. "He thinks he did something wrong." The image of Carlos's innocent smile burned itself into Alex's memory, a reminder that justice without compassion can become another form of cruelty. Every war has casualties, but the hardest truth to accept is that sometimes the people who pay the highest price are the ones who never chose to fight at all. The living room of the Mitchell family home felt smaller than Alex remembered, as if the weight of all their secrets had compressed the space into something too fragile to hold much more pain. He sat across from Robert on the same couch where he'd done homework as a child, where they'd watched baseball games during better times, where a family had slowly learned to stop seeing each other. Robert looked older than his 45 years, his construction worker's frame somehow diminished by weeks of sleepless nights and the kind of guilt that eats men from the inside out. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the rage that had defined their last encounter, only the exhausted honesty of someone who'd run out of places to hide. "I see Tommy every time I look at you," Robert admitted, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. "Not because you're weak like I told myself he was, but because you're brave like I never let him be. I was 17 when he died. Alex, 17 and useless and so goddamn scared that I've been running from that fear ever since." Margaret Mitchell entered the room carrying Tommy's belongings, her 70-year-old frame moving with the careful precision of someone bearing precious cargo. She placed the shoebox between father and son like an offering, like a bridge built from memory and regret. Together, they read Tommy's diary. Not just the final entries, but the years of writing that revealed a young man desperate to protect his little brother from the world that was crushing them both. Tommy had taken jobs to help pay for Robert's school clothes. He'd endured their father's worst beatings to keep Robert safe. He'd loved fiercely and died quietly, believing his sacrifice would somehow set his brother free. "He never wanted you to become like our father," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent guarding this truth. "He wanted you to become yourself, all of yourself, without shame." The town hall meeting that followed was Pastor Chen's idea. A community forum where truth could be spoken without the filter of social media or the distortion of gossip. The church fellowship hall filled with an uneasy mixture of Alex's supporters and opponents, people who'd stopped talking to each other weeks ago, forced to share the same air. Alex spoke first, but not about his father's failures or his own righteousness. Instead, he talked about Manuel's family, about Elena's quiet dignity, about the cost of pursuing justice without considering compassion. He proposed something that surprised everyone: the Tommy Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, funded by the settlement money from his father's lawsuit, dedicated to supporting LGBTQ youth from conservative families. The moment that changed everything came when Robert stood up, walking to the microphone with the unsteady gait of a man crossing a bridge he'd never imagined he'd have the courage to traverse. No prepared speech, no lawyer's carefully crafted apology. Just a father trying to find words for 28 years of running from his own heart. "I abandoned my son because I was afraid he'd die like my brother did," Robert said, his voice breaking on words he'd never spoken aloud. "I thought cruelty would make him strong enough to survive a world that killed Tommy. I was wrong about everything. About strength, about love, about what it means to protect the people you die for." The announcement that followed shocked even Alex. Robert pledged to match the scholarship fund dollar for dollar, to hire Manuel back with a raise and a public apology, to support the LGBTQ center Pastor Chen was planning to open. Not because he'd suddenly become a different man, but because he'd finally chosen to become the brother Tommy had believed he could be. The healing that followed wasn't quick or complete or Hollywood perfect. Robert still struggled with language, still flinched when Alex brought boyfriends home from college, still carried scars that might never fully fade. But he showed up to pride events, to family dinners where Alex's identity wasn't whispered around, to therapy sessions where they slowly learned to see each other as whole people rather than broken parts. A year later, at the Tommy Mitchell Memorial Center's opening ceremony, Alex stood at a podium facing a crowd that included his parents, Pastor Chen, the shelter kids who'd become his chosen family, and Marcus, back from deployment with his own healing to do. The center wasn't just a building, it was proof that communities could evolve, that families could survive truth, that love could grow strong enough to hold both justice and mercy. The final scene happened on a rainy Thursday evening at Tommy's grave, where Alex and Robert placed fresh flowers together for the first time. "I'm learning to be the Uncle Tommy needed," Robert said quietly, rain dampening their shoulders as they stood in companionable silence. "I'm learning that justice and mercy can coexist," Alex replied, watching water pool around the headstone like tears the earth had been waiting decades to shed. The rain that had once been punishment became renewal. Washing clean the space between them, making room for a relationship built not on pretending the past didn't happen, but on choosing what kind of future they'd create from its ashes. Have you ever had to choose between being right and being kind, between justice and healing? Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against our enemies, but against our own need to win at any cost. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real tales of families finding their way back to each other, of communities learning to hold space for difficult truths, and of the courage it takes to choose love even when love feels impossible. Because every ending is also a beginning, and every broken thing can be made beautiful again.